to ask my fellow scholars, and I'll make a little contribution at the end as well, to take just 10 minutes, to tell us what drew you to your field of interest as a scholar, number one, and number two, what did you glean from the research that you did on your particular topic? Did you find any surprises? Anything unexpected? And I think I'd like to lead off with Mitch.
Do I have to take 10 minutes?
No.
Well, I'm a Messianic Jew, so naturally this has all been very interesting to me. I think a lot of it started for me many, many years ago, not just recently. So this has been my hobby, my PhD, it's sort of been my side job, understanding Messianic Jewish history for a long time. I think it all started pretty naturally for me, and that is questions like, well, did my grandparents hear about Jesus? And I wanted to know. I mean, did they have a shot at this? And so I began looking at the history. And as I remember, when I started my PhD, it was actually I was going to write the next generation of A.E. Thompson's book on the history of Jewish missions. He was a Christian Missionary Alliance missionary to Israel, and actually he was continuing the tradition of writing a century of Jewish missions, because before him, a guy by the name of Deleroy, a Dutch missionary to the Jews, he actually wrote the 18th century. And then A.E. Thompson wrote the 19th century. And he quoted Deleroy. No, they both did the 19th century. I got it now. They both did the 19th century. And so actually, because Deleroy has not been translated into English, A.E. Thompson somehow got his part of what A.E. Thompson, what Deleroy did, a lot of the numbers, basically from baptismal records, he got that translated for one reason or another and put that in his book, A Century of Jewish Missions. Thompson's buried in the Christian Missionary Alliance Cemetery in Jerusalem. You can go visit his grave, and then afterwards go visit Derek Prince. So anyway, so I discovered Thompson, and that was like, wow, I'm not, a whole book on my question, as to whether or not Jews believed in Jesus. So I thought I would update it. Well, I started doing the research, and of course, like good PhD students, working with their mentors and so on, I thought there was going to be nothing, and then all of a sudden there was so much that it started out as, okay, well, maybe I'll do just, instead of a century of Jewish missions globally, I'll just do a century of Jewish missions in Europe. And I thought there wouldn't be a lot because I wouldn't find a whole lot in English. Then I did, and then I decided that I would make it continental Europe. Well, then I still found there was too much to manage. And so my mentor allowed me in a PhD to call it a survey of missions to the Jews in continental Europe between 1900 and 1950. So, the thing kept reducing, and then it ended up as a survey. But nobody had ever constructed that history. So constructing history is different than making history or reflecting on history. You need something to construct before you can reflect. And so there were pieces, but there was not any kind of geographical or Jewish community-wise, Orthodox, secular, and so on. And so, and when it came to intermission history, there was nothing. So that's why I did that for my time period. Thompson had did it for his time period. I didn't, so I did it for the first 50 years. And that's what got me interested. And then I just kept going and going and going. And one of my research tools was all of the Chosen People magazines from 1895. At that time, probably up until the 80s, were all on microfiche. And so to do my dissertation, I read all of them. And that took a while. And then lo and behold, and a lot of nickels, in the, for those of you who have done that. And then the next thing is I was interviewed by the Chosen People board for this being the president. And I remember talking to the board members, having just read all of the Chosen People history, realizing that I knew so much more than the board ever did about their own history, that I needed to become the president, so at least somebody knew what had happened, And so that's been the core of my interest. And I love, because of my my relationship with my Jewish historian wife, my caretaker, and because of our constant debates on historiography. Now, most marriages may not do that, but we do. And sometimes I fall asleep at night in the middle of a debate on historiography, Sorry for you to find out in this way. But anyway, you conquered. So I love having different views on how to reflect and how to research and how to look at the quote unquote facts as a whole. Is a word that we won't necessarily always use when you study history, but it's been wonderful to have different perspectives here, and it was just been very exciting because it helps me. Anytime somebody can help me look at what I'm used to looking at in a completely new way, or at least just a new way, it's so helpful to me. So I want to thank my Israeli friends here for helping me out, and I've yet to hear my state of Washington friend, and but it's been really great, and Yaakov's as well. So
thank you. Very good. Thank you, Mitch. We'll go with you, Moti.
Okay, so the first question was?
First question is, what drew you to your field of academic interest? And the second issue is from researching the particular topic that you presented today. Did you find any surprises? Anything new on that?
Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Jerusalem, in Israel, to a household which we can call secular Jews. And I don't really know, I cannot really put the finger of what exactly drew me into the study of Jewish messianism or Jewish expectations for the end of days. But it became very clear to me at some point that this is the subject that I'm interested in. And when I started my journey in academia, bachelor degree, I signed up and I majored in political science. But very quickly I realized that I really don't like political science so much. And so I shifted to Jewish history. And I think nowadays, when it comes to me, it's kind of a blend of both of the politics of Judaism is the field that I'm researching. And my interest was really in the study of Messianism. Maybe as a young man, I was drawn into, today it's embarrassing to say that, but I was drawn to socialism and not anymore. But yeah, maybe there was something in socialism that had this messianic allure, yes, of finding the salvation of mankind, through class struggle and whatever, and maybe through this I I came into the study of Jewish Messianism, and from Orthodoxy, from socialism, I shifted into the study of Orthodox belief in the end of days, Jewish Orthodoxy. And I've studied this subject from many different angles. I've studied the Temple Mount activists, I studied the optimists that I talked about, the settlers, and then I shifted to the study of ultra-Orthodoxy, which kind of happened by a coincidence. When I was a postdoctoral fellow at Brandeis in 2007, I heard that some personal archive of Neturei Karta, Neturei Karta's leader, Amram Bloy, reached Boston University. So Boston acquired the archives of Neturei Karta. And so since I was studying Orthodoxy, I said I might as well go and give it a look. And this was the surprise, that I realized that the ultra-Orthodox, the radicals, the Hungarians, are so embedded in Messianic expectations. I didn't know that this is what I'm going to find. This was really a surprise for me. And maybe because of my interest in Messianism and the study that I've made in Jewish Messianism, I was able to, to smell it better maybe than other people who studied it in the past. So this is how I came it. And now I just want to say a few words. The last words, that now the new big project is now Christian Messianism, and I'm studying the evangelicals. And this is how I met Mitch, and this is how we came to know one another, through the study of American evangelicals and the attitude toward Israel.
Thank you. And look at to my right.
So I have to be very honest about that. I'm not sure if I believe in God, or what is the degree of my belief in God. But on the other hand, I have no other explanation why my life has been so interesting and fulfilling without the assistance of God, who helped me, in certain junctions in my life to make what later on I revealed was the right choice. So there were so many points along my life in that manner, then that the only explanation that I can give them is, in fact, the intervention of God, of whom I may not believe, but that's the only explanation that I have. So I grew up in an Orthodox observant family, and I led the life of a Jewish believer until about I was 25 years old. I studied in an Orthodox schools and yeshivas, etc., etc. And then I was also drawn to the humanities, to the study of the humanities. But back then, that wasn't considered a good future for a person to deal with such subject, because there was not enough parnose. Parnose meaning you cannot make livelihood from that profession. So I had to give it up, and my parents decided I should become a dentist. It's a good profession, and we are three siblings, me and a brother and a sister. So I was sent to study a dentist. My brother was sent to study to become an accountant, and my sister was sent to study to become a lawyer. Okay, and so we had
All your bases covered.
okay, we had all the bases covered, and so, but eventually I couldn't resist my own instinct. So when I had to write a thesis for my DMD title, DMD is like DDS in America, so I rebelled against the system and wrote my thesis about philosophy of medicine. So this is why I already I marked myself to that idea of becoming a scholar of humanistics. So that went on for a couple of years, and then at some point in my life, I began to search for more spiritual or whatever interest, and then I began to study Yiddish, and then that led me to another a PhD, which I completed, and then that was not enough for me, and then I continued to another PhD in Jewish history. And during all that time, the one thing that I was very lucky about is that I also by accident I became interested in the study of genealogy, especially of my own ancestry. And why is that so important to me? I didn't realize it beforehand, but later on, because my father was a Holocaust survivor, he lost all his family in Auschwitz, and he never wanted to speak about his childhood years or his past or anything like that. But it so happened, that I fell upon this questionnaire about the history of the family, and I needed to file out the names, of the relatives, etc., etc. And I came with that to my father, and once I presented to him a certain question, he would answer that. I mean, if I would just ask him, tell me about your past, he said, no, I don't want to do it. But then I discovered that when I presented him with a special question, then he would answer it. Then I decided to look for more issues to question him about. So that on for a couple of years, on those couple of years, which were also the last years of his life, I was able to study about where he came from, what were his beliefs, where did he study, what was his family like, things that I was already in my 50s when that happened. So until then, I didn't know anything about his family. And so I was very lucky in that I managed in the last years of his life to get all that information, to be connected with that history, which I followed on later on in the dissertation that I wrote, and then in the next dissertation that I wrote, they're all connected to this issue. Also, I mentioned that I fell to the subject of Messianic Judaism by mistake. I didn't mean to be involved in this issue. It just so happened that I was approached, I answered the question, and the topic seemed so interesting to me that I followed it up with a little article. And that little article, I spoke with Moti. He told me, look, I'm going to meet the chosen people. I said, look, I just wrote an article about it, and I told him about the article, and so the connection was made. So you can interpret it in whatever way you want it. So now I did this. A couple of months ago, I gave another lecture on the subject of Messianic Judaism in a conference in Israel, where I described how the Messianic Jewish movement in Palestine, mandatory Palestine, in the early days of the state of Israel. So I don't know where the future will lead me to, but this is where I stand now with this topic. Although it's not my main topic. My main topic is Jewish Orthodoxy and extreme Orthodoxy and things like that. But the idea that there are people who are believers and they have firm beliefs in God, and they are willing to commit themselves to that kind of belief, this is something that really attracts me. So I'm not sure if I will one day become a believer in Jesus. I might become a Satmar Hasid. This is more plausible. Yeah. So I'm not sure, because Mitch said that because he had so much knowledge about Messianic Judaism, he felt that people felt that he was the right person to fill that position of president. With Orthodox Judaism, the more you know, the less chances are for you to become a leader, because there are many things you are not supposed to know, which I do, and I'm not supposed to know them, I'm not supposed to write about them, but people respect me when they discover that I know things, but I don't tell everybody about them. So.
Now we're interested.
Wait till my book comes out.
Tell them you're a goy and it won't tell me otherwise.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Are you finished?
I'm finished
Okay.
for now.
For now, right. That's always the caveat. Okay, well, let's see. I'll just follow up the rear here. I'm not going to take a lot of time. My field of interest, I was about now I came to PhD study, rather late. Was a race between the degree, Social Security, and death. So we beat out death, and I actually defended my dissertation 1 month after I qualified for Social Security. So in about 13 years ago, Kirsten and I, my wife, were walking right around the corner from the 72nd Street building at one of those outdoor stalls where people have books, and there was a tiny, slim little volume that was between Philosophy for Dummies and some book on geometry. And I pulled it out, and it had a cover that said, One Destiny and Epistle to the Christians by a man named Sholem. Now, I knew the name Sholem was floating around my consciousness somewhere. I didn't have anything to hang that hook on, but it was a short essay, and it was a red-hot cri de coeur on the part of a Jew toward a Christian audience that he knew and loved. And it was so gripping that I had to know more about this guy, and that it turned out that somebody in Berkeley, California, was something of a Sholem scholar, Naomi Seidman, at the Graduate Theological Union. I went up there to interview, and everybody gave me a glad hand and lunch and talked it all up. And when I walked into her office, she asked me what I was doing there, and I said, well, I'd like to look at Sholem work. She said, really, how's your Yiddish? And I said, my Yiddish is actually practically non-existent. She said, dripping with contempt, as I recall, how do you expect to do the work you say you want to do if you don't know the language that the writer that you're researching actually wrote in? Well, I had to admit she had a point. And after a couple of email exchanges, she said, well, you go get a Yiddish program somewhere and get some preparation and then come back and apply, which I did. She opened the door. I continued my Yiddish studies. And so my field of interest became Jewish-Christian relations in America during the Nazi era. And I structured a dissertation around 4 events that took place in Madison Square Garden between the years 1933 and 1945 that I will briefly allude to in the presentation that I'm going to be giving. And I spent hours and hours and hours poring over the old issue, the microfiche, the old issues of the Jewish Daily Forward in Yiddish. And though I sometimes got tired of writing the dissertation, I never got tired of the material. It just keeps giving and giving and giving. And so I went into a PhD program realizing that I had wide gaps in my knowledge, how little I realized how narrow the gaps in my ignorance were until I got into that world. And it just continues to give and to give and to give as modern Jewish history, modern Jewish views of Jesus in scholarship, art, and literature is sort of the wheelhouse of where my attractions are. So now with about the 15 minutes left of time that we have, I will do a little bit of housekeeping with you guys and ask if there are any questions that you might have for any members of these 3, because you haven't heard my presentation yet, that went unasked because of the expediencies of time. Go ahead.
Has the view of Messianic Judaism shifted or changed in Israel? Is it looked at negatively or positively?
Whom are you asking?
I guess
You.
You can answer it better than me.
Well, from a different perspective. But How do Israelis look at
Like,
Messianic Jews?
I guess on a personal level, were either of your families upset when you started to study this or get involved with studying Messianic Judaism?
Well, my family, well, that's not my main field of interest. And I'm telling them I'm studying it, but they know that I'm not spiritually connected with that movement. So they just view it. I mean, I studied Satmar Hasidism, which might be even more disturbing to my secular family. Yeah, but they don't care about it because they know that I'm not involved in that spiritually. So the same with this one. So I'm not involved. I'm just looking looking at it from the outside and trying to figure out what is going on. So it's not a personal thing.
How are the Hasidic communities? How are the Hasidic communities in the land evolving in a post-Holocaust world where it's getting harder and harder to make this a significant center of one's consciousness, of one's communal cohesion, being the Shoah, as it becomes more distant in people's memories and as the generation of survivors dies off? What is giving cohesion to Hasidic communities in the land in the absence of living memory of the Shoah?
Maybe I'll start. Okay. It's community. It's community. It's a very tight community. And this is what keeps it together. Sociologists call it the Enclave. And it has very specific characteristics that keeps the cohesion together. Now, the problem is for them, from their perspective, that they've done such a great job that it's becoming too large to be considered an enclave anymore. Yeah. That's so they've done a great job, a wonderful job of bringing it together after the Holocaust. And now the biggest challenge is to keep it like that.
Moti, I have a question for you. And from your presentation, you had talked about how Rabbi Shapira thought, you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember his name, that particular Sephardic was a Messiah. How did someone in Eastern Europe, and probably Ashkenazi, come to figure that a Sephardic in Palestine at that time had become the Messiah? What were his conclusions? How did he come to that? Or was it all just that fervor, that eschatological fervor that they had going on at that time?
So there is a Hasidic tradition that says that in every generation, there is a righteous man that can be considered a candidate for the Messiah. So, and since they were living in this notion that these are indeed the last days, and so this righteous man has to step up. They were looking, they were searching, they sent emissaries to find that man. And so he had the person that he trusted in Jerusalem that hinted to that Sephardic rabbi. He was very old and he was a mystic and so on. So they've done their research, their inquiries. It's a wonderful story, standing by itself, a wonderful story. And this is how they concluded that this is the man. Yeah, but this was an outstanding, kind of story.
Okay.
For Moti and for Menachem, we've been talking about the fast growth, biological mostly, I guess, of the Hasidic community of the Haredim. How do you believe that was going to impact Judaism as a whole going forward, both in Israel, the two great centers in Israel and America? I'm just curious to know where do you see this going, the great growth of the Haredim?
You start, Menachem.
Well, that's a difficult question. There are a lot of governmental organization who are trying to figure out what to do with it, because of mainly one major problem is that the Haredi families' income is relatively low, so they are dependent on governmental payments for them. And as long as they're a relatively small group, then that's okay. But the rest of the Israelis can pay up the check. But if they're become a larger segment of the Israeli societies, then there will be no one to pay for their way of life, which the most of the men do not go out to work and do not support their families, so they are basically living, or many or large part of the income comes from Social Security transfers. So there are a lot of debate about how to tackle this problem, and till now we don't know what's going to happen. There are all sorts of initiatives. There is a beginning of a movement within the Haredi community for them to have a more a general education that will prepare them for the modern world. This is going relatively slowly, but it's advancing. So in hope that maybe in 10 years' time this will catch on, and more Haredim will attend, like advanced courses, professional courses, will attend academy, etc., and will be more equipped for modern life.
I would say that there are two groups within the Haredi community which are the most vulnerable. The first is the young men, young adults, and the second is the women in the community. Young men are sent to study in yeshivot. Yeah. And yeshiva is a very demanding lifestyle that requires people to sit and to study the Torah from morning to night, in a setting of dormitories and so on. And it's not a kind of lifestyle that every single person in the world can do. Yeah. So there are many dropouts, but they are not dropping out. They are still staying in, but they mentally drop out. Yes. So, and if there will be a rebellion one day, if there will be a yeshiva spring, or a Jewish spring or something like that, I suspect that it would come from this subgroup of those men that are sitting in yeshivot and they just don't want to be there. And it's a large group. And the second is women and women's advancement. And there's, Haredi family builds on the women's financial, abilities, because the men go to the yeshiva, the wife has to go and bring the income, and they just from one hand. From the other hand, this community doesn't want to elevate the status of women and give them more power. They want the men to be controlling, and the women, and there are all kinds of mechanisms in which they were implementing that to suppress the advancement of women. But it creates this dissonance inside this community. From one hand, you want the women to go out and work and bring an income, but you don't want them to be lawyers and doctors, and you don't want to teach them to become professionals, So, and this creates these tensions inside the community. In Israel, yeah, exactly. So the woman has to have 8 children or 9 children, and she needs to do the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning, the this and that. So she has girls to help her, yes, but but she has to do all of that, and on top of that, she has to go to work, and she brings low income because she can be a secretary, or she can be a preschool teacher or something like that. She cannot be a lawyer, she cannot be or something, so this creates this tension. So I guessing, so if there will be cracks, if there will be breaking points, it will be either the young men in the yeshivot or the women that will rebel, against this situation.
Considering the very large impact that Leopold Kohn had on the
the Messianic movement in America and like the obviously large impact that his Hasidic training and upbringing had on him, are there any elements of today's Messianic movement that we can say, oh, that looks pretty directly descended from Hungarian Hasidism?
Well, just so you know, I almost answered the last question because my Hebrew name is Menachem, and I didn't know which one you meant. Just so you know. So you want to know whether or not any of the Messianic communities we see around mirror some of the traditions, values, way of life as the Satmar, or the more fundamentalist Hungarian Hasidism? Is that it, Elijah?
More like the general movement. Are there any like pockets of Hasidism, like
Messianic Jewish Hasids.
no, more like the Hasidic kind of reality that Cohn grew up in? Like, did any of that carry over into his ministry and therefore into like the broader
Okay.
like ministry?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the whole sense of being part of the Jewish community, that they had a strong sense of Jewish community. I think observing the Jewish calendar. I mean, fundamental. Remember, Leopold and Joseph were probably two different kinds of Jews, but Joseph learned how to be a Jew from his father. But his father's Jewish identity, faith, community was transforming as the years went by too. Nobody stays still. You know, actually, as you look forward in Leopold's pictures, you know, and when he was younger, not just that his hair was darker, but when he was younger, he seemed to be a little more Hasidic in look. And as time went on, he was becoming more New York urbane. You know what I mean? And whereas anything you see of Joseph, he was just looking like a Jewish businessman, you know. And so I think that Jewish people, being Jewish is a moving target from a sociological and community perspective. Some people, I would say even from a religious perspective, but those changes take longer. But I would say that this whole idea of being Jewish as being important, I think was extremely, the Cohen mark was on the organization early on. And so everything that Leopold did. So for example, Leopold, because being Jewish is a whole complexity of issues. So it's religion, it's community, it's Achavas Yisrael, it's loving your fellow Jew and everything else. And so Leopold did all those things probably quite naturally. Joseph probably did it naturally, but not as naturally as his father. He was following a pattern. And I was looking for a lot of tension between Joseph and his father, and there was never a lot of tension. The only time Joseph ever spoke disparagingly, really, of his father was when he was talking about fundraising and management, feeling that his father didn't do either, and that he was the one that really had to do that stuff. But I would say the benevolence that Leopold started, caring for marginalized immigrant Jewish people, carried over into Joseph in his work with fighting anti-Semitism and caring for Holocaust, caring for people who were going to go through the Holocaust, and caring for displaced persons. He made sure that he cared for that, raised money for it. And Joseph also had a weird touch. Joseph started the Great Tribulation Fund. And the Great Tribulation Fund, he viewed the next Holocaust as the tribulation period and was raising money to help Jews when they were facing the Great Tribulation. And he felt like the Holocaust was a precursor to that event. That's a very messy area to go down. That's a messy trail to go down theologically. But he did feel that way, and eventually that became a rather large amount of money, which the next president, Daniel Fuchs, spent on newspaper ads and staff. It was millions of dollars. Today, Chosen People Ministries is ministering to Holocaust survivors in Israel, right? And so I think that benevolence stream, Achavas Israel, caring for your fellow Jew, both evangelistically and with practical service, I think has continued through. So that's just one small illustration of what has carried on through the centuries.
I actually want to throw an idea to the conversation. As I said earlier, I don't know much about the Cohen family and what they believed in. But when I heard your talk, Mitch, today, and I was listening to the sermon that you played, and I actually saw something which I think is a continuation of the Hasidic tradition, which is the premillennial dispensationalism. I think I saw in it something similar to the ideas that I presented in my talk that Kiva Yosef Schlesinger was making, that the end of days is an event that's going to happen soon, that there is a deterioration in humankind, there is a deterioration in faith, and all these deterioration reached to such a low point where only God can intervene and bring salvation. And this is going to happen through a miraculous event. And God will send from heaven a Messiah. So actually, when you think about that and you see the transitions that Leopold Cohen has made from the Hungarian background to the Christian, and you see this is basically not so far away from where he used to stand.
Can I comment on Moti's statement just for a moment? Moti, the interesting thing, that's very interesting, but the interesting thing to me is when you think about it, we, of course, we're going to interpret this to some degree historically or sociologically or culturally, but actually, even though the Hungarian fundamentalists were focused on the Talmud, they did have a sound biblical basis for their beliefs because Talmud would be based on the Bible. And so I think that the eschatological hope that the Cohens continued, that they learned through being Hasidic, but maybe the flames were even fanned hotter later on through the Cohens, in the life of the Cohens, came about because there was a shared biblical heritage of these events that are outlined in Ezekiel and Daniel and Isaiah and even Deuteronomy and so on. So because of this, I think there were a lot of theological commonalities between the Hasidim and the Cohens that went beyond the Hasidism, but actually went back to a common source for all of these beliefs. That's my opinion.
And I want to inject one more thing, and there was also the Holocaust, which was, in the eyes of everyone, was this were the tribulations. Yes.
All right, we're going to have one more question, and then we need to move on. So, Peter,
Why? You're the only one speaking.
Yeah,
Just
but
kidding.
I can send it by attachment, but then you miss the entertainment.
I had a question, as we're talking about eschatology, I had a question for Dr. Inbari. You talked about the religious Zionist on the one hand and the Hungarian ultra-Orthodox on the other hand. A difference in how they saw Zionism, the one as a preparation for the coming of the Messiah, the other as a negative thing that had to happen before the Messiah comes. Are there more differences in the Messianic expectations between the two groups?
These are the different structures of end days. One that goes through human progress and step by step, whereas one is through deterioration and escalation, until you reach such a low point that only God can intervene and, fix things. So this is just there's a different understanding of how the events of the end is going to take place.